When the United Nations was established was at the end of World War II, and the main preoccupation at that time was to prevent another major war. So it was established as a war prevention institution, and therefore concerned with the peaceful resolution of disputes between governments. It was also very much affected by the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japanese cities at the end of World War II, that gave a feeling that it was not just a matter of desirability to prevent another war, but really the future of humanity depended on having an effective instrument of war prevention. At the same time, the most powerful countries, the countries that had defeated Germany and Italy in World War II, were not prepared to make the UN strong enough to carry out this mission. And in fact, for two different reasons, they actually wanted a weak United Nations. The Soviet Union wanted a weak United Nations because it anticipated that it would be outvoted in any kind of majority rule decision-making procedure. And so it insisted on having a right of veto that meant that it didn't have to obey it, or let me put it differently, that it could block any Security Council decision, and only the Security Council had the power or the authority to reach decisions. At the same time, countries like the United States, the UK, and France also wanted the veto because they feared that a majority would emerge out of the post-war situation that would interfere with their strategic positions in the world. And for the UK and France, they were particularly concerned with not having their colonial power and authority delegitimized, made illegal. And for the United States, it was not willing to give up its unconditional sovereignty and its role as the leader of the post-war world. So security and peace were left in the hands of the powerful, not in the hands of the UN. And that resulted in a security system that still exists, which is partly based on what's called deterrence, that countries make their own military capabilities so formidable that a potential enemy will fear attacking because it would receive a devastating response. And partly by great power peacekeeping of the sort that's evident in, to some degree, in Ukraine, where on the one side, Russia is trying to establish its traditional sphere of influence, and on the other side, the US-led NATO countries are trying to uphold an idea of prohibiting aggressive uses of force. So you have a geopolitical framework that limits the capability of the UN to do what it was established to do. At the same time, the UN has done things that are very useful to a lot of people in the world, including in the sphere of economic and social development. And it also performs a symbolic function in situations such as are evolving in the Middle East at the moment and in many other settings, of distinguishing between legitimate or permissible behavior and illegitimate and impermissible behavior. And this stimulates popular movements throughout the world. So the UN is important for the peoples of the world, even though it has been disappointing in regulating the behavior of the principal governments in the world. I only worked for the United Nations between 2008 and 2014. And at that time, the issue that I was responsible for was reporting to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the General Assembly in New York on whether Israel was obeying international humanitarian law in the manner by which they were occupying these territories that they had militarily conquered in 1967. The general conclusion was that they were not upholding international obligations and that they were violating the rights of the Palestinian people in three principal ways. One was to deny the prospects of the inalienable fundamental right of self-determination, which people understand as a matter of Palestinian statehood in historic Palestine. The second major area of violation was the establishment of Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, which were prohibited explicitly in Article 49, Paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs belligerent occupation. Israel established as many as 250 unlawful settlements and had as many as 500,000 people living in them, and currently proposes expanding that number by 100%. The third area is collective punishment, to which the Palestinian people have been subjected to throughout this period of occupation in many, many forms, including the denial of their right of mobility and the right to have a normal civilian life. And leading human rights organizations, in my reports, the conclusion has been widely reached that Israel maintains an apartheid system of control over the Palestinian people. And apartheid is an international crime, was developed initially in response to the suppression of Black Africans in South Africa, but later generalized as a prohibition on any kind of exploitative and hierarchical system where one race dominates another race. And what has happened in occupied Palestine, and also actually in Israel itself, is for Jews to claim supremacy and to subjugate the Palestinian people. So it's not a matter of racial division, but a matter of racial domination. And that is clearly a serious violation of international law, and it was so treated during the anti-apartheid campaign directed at South Africa. The difference between South Africa and Israel is that South Africa was not protected by these geopolitical actors, either US or Europe. and therefore it has been shielded from the obligation to uphold international law. And this has produced over the years a political and humanitarian catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Well, I think in the current situation, I would have to say that the always abusive Israeli occupation, since it began in 1967, has further deteriorated as a response to the Hamas attack of October 7th and become a mixture of ethnic cleansing through the forced displacement of over 1 million Palestinians, combined with policies that have the appearance of violating the Genocide Convention. So I would have to inform students that from a technical point of view, Israel is committing daily crimes of a serious, severe nature against the Palestinians as a whole, and that this cannot be justified by the claim that Hamas committed war crimes of its own, which it did in the October 7th attack, but that doesn't enable Israel to legally commit crimes of its own. And it is bound by international law, and the only thing it can do is establish some kind of security as the occupying power. But in doing that, it has a primary responsibility to protect the civilian population and not to treat the civilian population as part of the threat to its security, as it has been doing, and imposing very harsh and legally and morally unacceptable conditions, such as the decree cutting off all food, fuel, electricity, and water, which is clearly a kind of genocidal siege that is a major international crime. And the language used by Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, in which he called Palestinians human animals that have to be treated accordingly, is the kind of genocidal language that exhibits the intentions of the Israeli government. And what was said by Gallant has not been qualified or modified since he made that statement on October 9th, I believe. And Israel has followed those policies and must be held, or should be held, legally accountable for implementing that. The United Nations is disabled from taking responsibility by the UN being subject to the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and the US has shown its intention, as has UK and France, to veto any effort to hold Israel accountable or even to establish a humanitarian pause or a unrestricted access for relief efforts of medicine and food, water, fuel. This is outrageous behavior, in my view, by those geopolitical actors. It's, as I say, protected in a certain way by their right of veto, but it still makes them complicit in carrying out the crime of genocide and ethnic cleansing, indiscriminate violence, and the general forcible treatment of all Palestinians. As far as Hamas's identity as a terrorist organization is concerned, I think that President Erdogan is correct. It committed acts in the attack on October 7th that can be characterized as terrorist because they involved the killing and hostage-taking of civilians, and that is clearly prohibited in international humanitarian law. But Hamas is the elected administrative government of Gaza, supported by many people that have nothing to do with Hamas as a resistance actor that is seeking to achieve the rights that the Palestinian people are entitled to. And so, on the one side, it is acting unlawfully, and on the other side, it is the representative of the people of Gaza. And the event, the October 7th event, is a hybrid event that is partly resistance and partly this commission of war crimes. If the same logic was applied to Israel, it would also be characterized properly and even with greater justification as a terrorist organization, because it certainly committed acts in the course of its existence that qualify as international terrorism. It's assassinated leaders in the West Bank, it's abused prisoners and children, and a great number of specific acts that could be called and treated as terrorism. And therefore, if that would alter its identity as a government, it would really change the nature of international relations, because almost all of the important governments in the world have committed acts of terrorism in the course of their existence. And yet one continues to treat them as political actors. They should be held accountable for those policies that it implements that have a terrorist or criminal character. But that doesn't mean that they should, as actors, be called terrorist entities. And in that sense, I think what Erdogan said is a reasonable clarification of the relationship between law and politics in the context of Gaza. If you, as the many representatives of governments in the UN debates have been saying, and in the media, they have just automatically treated Hamas as a terrorist organization. And they've used it in such a way as to say that Israel would have a justification for destroying Hamas, even though it's only partly a military actor. It has a political and social functions and divisions, personnel, and certainly the designation of Hamas as terrorist doesn't give it any kind of recognition for the fact that it governs the civilian population of Gaza as a whole, and that Israel is treating that civilian population as part of the designation of human animal that it is entitled to destroy. So it's totally unacceptable, the kind of discourse that has been used so far. Well, I think that the language of the Torah is addressed to personal relationships and has never characterized the collective behavior of Jewish states or the Jewish nation. If one reads the Bible, for instance, it's filled with incidents where the Jewish nation killed in order to pursue its security goals or its political ambitions, and therefore you cannot derive a pacifist ethic from the Jewish tradition. And in that sense, it's not different from other main ethical traditions, including Christian and Muslim. All of them have, each of them has the potentiality of becoming pacifist, but in their practice and interpretation, they have ways of justifying recourse to lethal violence, killing their enemy, defending their faith, promoting their faith, holy wars and sacred wars. And the whole debate about jihadism is the kind of Muslim equivalent of this sort of controversy that has sometimes been present in the Jewish ethical thought, but I don't consider it relevant to the ways in which Judaism has been institutionalized in the Israeli government or by a secular Zionists. Of course, anything is possible, but it's highly unlikely in my view. Israel and Iran particularly have been deeply antagonistic ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1978. Beyond that, I think it's more plausible to say that Israel let the October 7th attack occur so it would have the pretext for this enormous outpouring of violence on its part in order to achieve greater control over not Gaza so much as the West Bank. What Israel really wants is to generate a conditions on the West Bank that will again dispossess a large number of Palestinians and create what amounts to a third Nakba of catastrophic removal from the land of the Palestinian people in large numbers. And in this sense, as horrible as it may sound, Gaza is a sideshow to the real drama, which concerns what is the destiny of the West Bank. And Israel made clear that it was not prepared to compromise about Jerusalem just after the '67 war. It incorporated Jerusalem. But what it never had the political leverage to do was to incorporate in its sovereign space the West Bank, which is part of what the Zionist project views as the so-called Promised Land. And the Promised Land is essentially from the what they call from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the... And if you read the Israeli Basic Law of 2018, you will understand, I think, that the Zionist hope and expectation was to establish Jewish supremacy over the entire Promised Land. And since January 1st of 2023, when the Netanyahu coalition government assumed power, you had an escalation of this expectation and very provocative actions in Al-Aqsa Mosque area and in the West Bank, all designed, I think, to create some kind of reaction that would give Israel the pretext of doing what it's now doing. The absence of a sustained Palestinian reaction to settler violence and other provocations meant that something more dramatic had to occur. And you can view the Gaza attack, the Hamas attack, as fulfilling that need to give Israel a sufficient political justification for doing what it's doing now. But there are two things that should be kept in mind. The first is that, contrary to the public debate, one should watch what happens in the West Bank. That's the crucial area. And secondly, that even though I say this scenario has some plausibility as compared to the other one, it still lacks evidence that this is what really took place. In other words, it's speculative, not supported by facts, although the Egyptians claim on a fairly high level that they warned Netanyahu of this impending Hamas attack the week before the attack took place. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not in a position to say. Well, I think that certainly there are countries, including my own, the United States, that has the capability to stop Israel. But it has never shown the political will to compel Israel to deal in a justifiable way with the Palestinian people. And even in this extreme situation that is currently unfolding in Gaza, it continues to give unconditional support to Israel. So the capability to stop Israel definitely exists, but the political will seems permanently unavailable. And that's the tragedy of the Palestinians, is to be in that situation where those that could uphold its rights are unwilling to do so. It remains to be seen. It depends on what Turkey seeks to achieve and what reaction that creates, particularly on the part of the US, Europe, and Israel. One has to assume that any pro-Palestinian interference by Turkey will, under current conditions, be rejected, at least in the immediate future. Whether, as these developments unfold, a situation will exist where the parties, including Israel and the US, want the violence to stop and want the overall danger of a wider war to be avoided, that situation develops, then the Turkish initiatives might be seen as the best way of reaching those objectives. But the situation now doesn't support any favorable impact resulting from a Turkish initiative, though it may be important for Turkey's regional and global reputation if they try to do their best to protect the Palestinian and to end this genocidal violence. The question of what it means to be effective is not clear, because if you mean being effective can only be measured by how it alters the conflict, then one has to be somewhat pessimistic. If you mean by being effective, trying to do the right thing under the circumstances and conveying that within the UN and in the wider international community, then it's very important for Turkey to take this kind of initiative. Something that will expand the conflict, magnify the conflict, which is bad enough as it is, and create additional uncertainty as to how much it will intensify this kind of war that has been taking shape, because you have to assume under present conditions, if Turkey really defends Palestinian rights against Israel, that the US and the European countries will act in response. So you will have and Turkey will be drawn into being a direct party to the war, which I don't think would be helpful for the Palestinians or itself. Well, I think it illustrates several things. One is racism, that the Ukrainians are white and Arabs are viewed as, in some sense, non-white. It's also a matter of religious affinity. The Ukrainians are by and large Christians, and obviously the Palestinians are by and large Islamic. It also illustrates the moral hypocrisy of using international human rights when it serves your foreign policy purposes and ignoring them when it interferes with your foreign policy purposes. So it exhibits a moral and legal hypocrisy and double standards. You treat Ukraine one way and Palestine another way. What Israel's doing to the Palestinian peoples is far worse than what Russia has done in Ukraine. So it accentuates this issue of double standards. If you're to be humanistic in these situations, you have to be consistent. If you're not consistent, you're being opportunistic and using humanism to justify certain policies, but not to condemn others that are not against your pragmatic purposes. Well, see, the situations are different, and the Russian initial attack looked like a classic example of aggression across an international boundary. Because Hamas is occupied territory, it's really not susceptible to the same kind of legal and political analysis. And the Hamas attack was not aggression in the same sense. It was an isolated event. Israel had every right to try to prevent and to protect its security within its territory, but it can't claim self-defense in that sort of situation. So it's from the point of view of the use of force, the situations have to be understood as somewhat different, but it doesn't in any way justify the application of double standards and the excessive violence, collective punishment that has been part of Israel's response. The Balfour Declaration was a statement by the British Foreign Secretary, British support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in mandated Palestine, which was being administered at the time by the UK. It was purely a colonial decree had no legitimate foundation in either law or morality. And also it's never been applied in an equal way. The language of the Balfour Declaration, if you read it, tries to be somewhat balanced between the claims to have a Jewish homeland and the rights of the indigenous population. And what Britain did for colonialist reasons was to give much greater freedom to the Zionist movement. And of course, it was in a historical time in which Nazism emerged in Germany, and there was legitimate anti-Semitism of a very extreme nature, so that there was a kind of humanistic justification for a Jewish homeland. And Zionism was rather clever. At every stage, it accepted what it could get. And then when it got it, it wanted more. So when it had a homeland, it wanted a state. And when it was given a state in a partitioned Palestine, it wanted more of that state for itself at the expense of the Palestinians. So that the Balfour Declaration can be seen as a kind of important milestone in the narrative that governs the establishment of Israel and the pursuit of the Zionist state and the origins of the Palestinian ordeal and tragedy. Well, first of all, normalization in abnormal times is something of a contradiction. When normalization was the policy of Turkey, the situation was relatively calm. It was criticized at the time as a betrayal of Palestinian struggle and was seen as a way of expanding Turkey's trade and investment relationships, and at the cost of weakening the Palestinian struggle. Under the weight of the present extremist Israeli behavior, an adjustment seems reasonable and appropriate, and I think that Turkey has done the right thing by withdrawing from, implicitly, I think didn't explicitly withdraw, but implicitly withdrawing from that kind of framework of normalcy. Normalization implies normalcy, and when that no longer exists, then adjustments are called for. Well, I think, in short, I think that This extremist Israeli government has articulated a maximalist view of the Zionist project. And that means two things. One is the eventual annexation or effective sovereignty over the West Bank, and a total Jewish supremacy in Jerusalem. And Al-Aqsa is the biggest obstacle to the reality of that supremacy. The UN can't effectively challenge Israel so long as the US is supporting what it does. And it's not only the US, but the EU as well. And as long as this condition exists, Israel can do what it wants. It will alienate much of the world. When Netanyahu spoke at the UN, many delegations left the hall in opposition to what he was thought to be saying. So you have a condition where the UN is rendered helpless by the primacy of geopolitics. The region is in a very unstable situation now, so it's very hard to anticipate the future. I think Turkey, as compared to other countries, is acting responsibly and prudently in the crisis. So it should be fairly positive. Turkey has, all things considered, acted in a prudent and responsible fashion that could be constructive in relation to the Palestinian ordeal. And as far as the region is concerned, it has probably behaved more responsibly than any other important country, in the sense of trying to both be on the side of the oppressed and trying to find a peaceful solution. The UN could censure her if the political will existed, but again, that political will doesn't exist in the Security Council, and probably the General Assembly would be reluctant to criticize a high official of the EU. There have been important criticisms of her statement and calls for her resignation that have come from Europe, and I think include some governmental responses.